Hello and welcome to the Expanse. I'm the Quack, and I hope you're having less Quack day than myself. This is Ramblings of a Mad Duck. The name is quite literal. Instead of the scripted and structured content I usually put together, this content is instead going to be a lot more raw and unedited. Basically, it's going to be a one-man podcast of me talking and theorizing about the lore of World of Warcraft with a few images here and there. Why am I making this content? Well, ever since I started this channel, I have had a backlog of theories and topics I've wanted to talk about, that I just haven't got the time to do, or the theories have just become out of date by the time I got to them. This content is an attempt to remedy that, whilst also allowing me to upload more frequently. To also be clear, I have no intention of this content replacing the usual theories I put together. Okay, so, Afterlives Bastion. What interesting lore and speculation can we glean from this animatic? Well, the story at the forefront is interesting, as in Uther's passage through Bastion and his experiences overall set a very interesting picture for what will become of Bastion and the general theme that seems to be going on within the zone, and possibly the theme that's going to permeate throughout Erebus and the Shadowlands overall. I will eventually explain how I think this animatic eventually relates to those things. However, before I do, I'm going to focus on a specific scene that implies and explains a significant amount of things going on in World of Warcraft at the moment, and a possibility of at least explaining the general motives of certain characters, whilst also possibly opening the way for redemption of other, possibly irredeemable characters. The specific scene I'm talking about is when Uther's soul gets split. Now, the general assumption that's been going around is that the light split Uther's soul. I personally don't agree with that. I think Arthas quite specifically split Uther's soul. Why? Well, there are two possible reasons. The first reason is that it was just practical, as in when Varian got his soul split, one of the halves was incredibly easy to control, while the other was incredibly difficult to control. So on a practical level, it was probably easier for Arthas to just control one aspect of Uther instead of all of Uther's person. What I will say though is I think Uther may have been the first soul Arthas split, or at the very least was one of the first souls Arthas split. And the reason for this is specifically Gavinrad the Dire and Terranus Menethil, Arthas' father. Gavinrad the Dire, one of the original 5 paladins, turns up in the Frost DK Legion artifact questline. Basically, the DK has to defeat Gavinrad because he's trying to control the remaining pieces of the blade. Now, what's interesting about Gavinrad is that he still has his connection to the light, or seemingly has his connection to the light. So overall, it seems his soul wasn't split, and may have been putting up resistance within the blade, something Arthas may have had to deal with when he was the Lich King. And then there's Terranus Menethil, who, well, I'm almost certain Arthas had to deal with consistently throughout Wrath, especially after he put on the helm. The reason why is that I think Terranus' soul wasn't split, and it's also why I think his presence is made quite clear during the Fall of the Lich King trailer. And what's rather interesting is that because Arthas didn't split his soul, we had a major ally during our fight with Lich King, which eventually led to the fall of Arthas. So yeah, overall on a practical level, it was very smart for Arthas to start splitting souls because it was just easier to control them, and they would have less of a chance of resisting his control. On the other hand, however, Arthas' splitting of Uther's soul may have had absolutely nothing to do with practicality, and instead, especially for those who are fans of an Arthas redemption story, may be indications that he was fighting within the blade for an incredibly long time. The reason why is that when you look at the history of the Lich King and everything that Arthas did as the Lich King, there's a very distinct difference between what he was doing with souls prior to donning the helm and after he donned the helm. As in prior, he seemingly just collected them, as in he may have split them, like with Uther, or may have begun to split them towards the end of his campaign, maybe as he gained more power from the Maw. However, overall, he collected them, and we kind of see this in relation to the Halls of Reflection, where we have to fight a bunch of souls that he captured. Now when you compare this to post-donning the helm, Arthas does resurrect or take a few souls, specifically Dranosh and a few others, but other than that, a lot of the souls he seems to capture just get purged. They turn into wailing spirits and whatnot. And this is where something that Devos says in her confrontation with the Arbiter becomes very important.
If he had purged his life, we never would have known of this calamity!
if he had purged his soul, etc., etc. Now, the general assumption once again has been that that is referring to Uther purging his soul and becoming ascended, basically becoming a Kyrian. But what's rather odd is that when you look at the scene as a whole, what you actually find is that the his, or the he she is referring to, is actually Arthas. Because prior to saying if he had purged his soul, Devos says this.
The runes on his blade were unmistakable. This dark agent...
The runes on his blade were unmistakable. The his in this regard is Arthas, and overall there is no indication that Devos changed who she was talking about in regards to a he, as in, it doesn't seem like she was actually talking about Uther at all. It seems this entire conversation was about how Devos was basically explaining how Uther had come into contact with this agent of the jailer, who we know as Arthas. Now, what this seems to imply is that Arthas could have wiped Uther's memories, like just purged his soul completely, but he didn't. And what's interesting about this is that when you consider what's going on in the Maw, as in the countless souls that seem to be missing memories, it's not that hard to believe that Frostmourne had the ability to wipe memory of souls. So the question from here becomes, okay, why didn't Arthas purge Uther's soul? And if anything, why did Arthas allow Uther's fragmented spirit, specifically the light aspect, go to Bastion and act as a kind of warning? Because in one regard you could say that this was a part of the jailer's grand scheme to basically infiltrate Bastion and ruin things, which is definitely a possibility. But on the other end, it seems like the jailer was trying to keep everything he was doing quite secret, and was overall trying to avoid the eyes of those in the Shadowlands. So if anything, Uther's experience kind of acted as a warning. So the question becomes, once again, why did Arthas split Uther's soul? And this is where a very interesting quest line in ICC seemingly explains this entire scenario. What quest line am I talking about? Well, one of the original quests in ICC has players basically find Arthas' heart. Now, admittedly, we don't know what it is at the time, but basically we touch it and we get visions of this boy Arthas that kind of explains what we're going up against and why the Lich King is so dangerous. Now, what this boy Arthas explains is that basically the minute Arthas woke up from his slumber as the Lich King and kind of started moving around after he donned the helm, he removed his heart. Now, what's strange about Arthas removing his heart, it's not the fact that it technically removed his humanity, as in you can basically explain that away by saying, okay, he possibly placed all of his emotions, or attempted to place a lot of his more human emotions in his heart and ripped it out. What's truly odd about this heart is the fact that he threw it away. What I mean by this is, during the quest line, it becomes quite clear the heart is a weakness of the Lich King, as in we destroy it and it weakens the Lich King. So the question becomes, why do you throw it away? As in, why didn't he lock it up or put it somewhere that it couldn't be reached? And the answer seems to be that proximity to the heart also weakened the Lich King, so he didn't want to be near it, or at the very least, he might have had the urge to regain his humanity at some point. That seems to be the reason why he got rid of the heart in the first place. Now, the reason this is important is because, once again, during this quest line, Tyrion basically destroys the heart in the assumption that Arthas has basically disregarded all his humanity, that he is no longer, well, human, basically, that he's a monster that just needs to be completely destroyed. But, as most people know, that doesn't really line up with what happens at the very end of Wrath, where we kill Lich King and Arthas seems to be back to himself and that he's kind of woken up. And the answer I've come to, which seemingly reconciles this very weird disparity, is that where Tyrion did destroy the heart, weakening the Lich King, I don't think it weakened Lich King in the way he thought it would. As in, he destroys the heart, and with its connection to Arthas and its destruction, he may have lost a bit of his power. Or at least that seems to be what Tyrion understood in that situation. However, I think destroying the heart actually returned Arthas' humanity to him. As in, instead of destroying all the humanity that was placed in the heart, it kind of released it, and all of it went rushing back to Lich King. Hence why he was weakened the minute the heart was destroyed, but also why the Lich King threw it away. As in, proximity / the destruction of the heart basically help the willpower of Arthas Menethil, the human, return. And so the implication here is that from the minute Arthas picked up Frostmourne, his humanity was fighting back. And even when he donned the helm after he apparently discarded his humanity, Arthas' humanity was still fighting back. And so the jailer, assumedly, ripped out Arthas' heart, placed his humanity in that heart, and discarded it. And I assume, at the very least for the Light's Hope incident, and all of Arcturus and basically the DK starting area, DKs may have been dealing with a thoroughly in control jailer, as in the jailer had thorough control of Arthas. But then after the ICC incident, Arthas' humanity returned, and it's kind of why there was a stopgap, and it's kind of why we didn't get completely destroyed when we entered ICC. As in that last part of Arthas that was holding back the Scourge from destroying everything, specifically returned to Arthas when the heart was destroyed. Now how all of this relates to Uther is basically the idea that instead of it being a practical reason, Arthas, the last part of Arthas that remained, split Uther's soul with the specific purpose and hope that the faith aspect would end up in the Shadowlands, because assumedly at this point, because of his merger with the Lich King, or at least Frostmourne's whispers and the fact that he had been to ICC at this point, or at least Northrend at this point, he probably figured out what the Shadowlands was, had an idea, etc, etc. And so the human part of him was probably hoping that Uther's soul would act as a bit of a warning and possibly tip off the Kyrian and or the Shadowlands as a whole to the fact that the Maw was active and gaining power in another realm. The major implication here is that Arthas, over the course of his entire fall, or at least his humanity, was fighting back, and at a certain point was removed, but then was eventually returned to him thanks to us. And if anything, there may be proof of Arthas' soul being fragmented, or at least the resistance he was putting up as like a human being present in the Broken Shore. Or at least the resistance his humanity put up being present within the Broken Isles. The reason why I say this is because, well, there are fragments of Arthas all over the Broken Isle, and the Broken Isle, I almost guarantee you, has a connection to the Shadowlands. I'm not sure what, but there's something there. And so basically what I'm getting at is the idea that if Arthas was fighting back but was losing, then maybe the jailer was basically fragmenting his soul during this entire conflict they were having, or at least while Arthas put up resistance. And so fragments basically ended up scattered all over the Broken Isles, or at least that's why the fragments of Arthas ended up scattered all over the Broken Isles. But anyway, these two specific scenes basically imply that Arthas may be a lot more redeemable than we give him credit for. Moving on, we come to a very interesting question that was implied by Devos, and basically seems to be implied by Uther's soul getting split once again. And that question is, was Uther really supposed to go to Bastion? And in turn, if he wasn't, this implies a massive hole in the Arbiter's ability to judge souls. And what I mean by this is, Uther's soul was split. Obviously. One part went to Frostmourne, one part went to the Shadowlands. Seems like the light faith aspect went to the Shadowlands and in turn was given to Bastion. And admittedly, I'll say now, it's very interesting that the light aspect just went to the Shadowlands to begin with, and it didn't go to the light specifically, seeming to imply the Shadowlands is stopping the greater magics from gaining souls, or at the very least certain human souls, or more precisely mortal souls. But anyway, this faith aspect of Uther obviously got judged by the Arbiter and got sent to Bastion. But from what we've been told, I think it was Ian during the first announcement of the Shadowlands, the Arbiter literally looks over a soul's life and then sends it to the place it's supposed to go. If the Arbiter does look over a soul's life and then sends them to a certain afterlife they're supposed to go to, then why in the world did it not take into consideration that Uther's soul had been split? As in, it just seemingly took the faith aspect and ushered it off to Bastion, not considering the fact that this soul had, once again, literally been split, and so it was missing a part of who it was. The reason why I think this other piece of Uther would have affected where he ended up is because what most people seem to forget is that the reason Tyrion got exiled from the Paladin Order Hall, the reason why Stratholme basically fell, and the reason why Tyrion's son ended up as a Scarlet Crusader and then dead, is Uther. As in, Uther's the one that excommunicated him from the light and Lordaeron and exiled him in general. And the reason why he did it, by the way, was because Eitrig saved Tyrion's life. Tyrion made a vow to Eitrig, and Tyrion refused to break that vow, and so he was exiled for that. So overall, I feel like I can safely say Uther was far from a saint, and it makes me wonder if he would have ended up in a different realm, at least for a little while, before ending up in Bastion. But anyway, the major indication here is that the Arbiter and the Kyrian obviously can't tell if a soul is wounded when they first pick them up, and or judge them. But what's even more strange is that if the Arbiter does get the context of a person's life, it seemingly lacks the ability to judge that life or take into consideration that life. The Arbiter seemingly disregards the context a soul has had in life if it can see what that person has gone through, which is very interesting because it basically implies that if certain things happen to a soul that were completely out of their control, similar to Uther and the fact that his soul was split, they will still be placed in certain areas of the Shadowlands, even though their soul may not be worthy of that area. And this whole possibility of the Arbiter having a blind spot and the Arbiter disregarding certain events that may have happened in a soul's life, firstly, seems to indicate the Arbiter specifically looks at how a soul comes to the Shadowlands, as in Uther's soul may have been split in an extremely painful way, but that specifically the faith aspect ended up in front of the Arbiter, so the Arbiter sent it to Bastion. That seems to be the only criteria the Arbiter goes by, or at least that seems to be the only criteria the Arbiter goes by. And secondly, if the Arbiter does judge souls in this manner, then Sylvannas Windrunner makes perfect sense. Like, her entire character from when she died to the present makes too much sense, as in motives and all. Strangely enough, this basically explains the morally grey aspect, or at least I think it explains the morally grey aspect Blizzard's been going on about since BFA. That's kind of made no sense. What am I talking about? Well, what was it? Resurrection and Undeath Explained. A theory I did, I think it was the start of 2019, sometime around then. An old theory I did, basically. In that theory, I basically go into explaining how resurrection works, and one of the concepts I basically end up going into is the idea of full resurrection versus partial resurrection. And the idea was basically that full resurrection is the type of thing where you'll bring back the whole person. It's very, very rare in lore, and it's kind of the thing that we do on a regular basis with like B-reses and resurrection, etc, etc. And then there's partial resurrection. This form of resurrection is how I explained how Sylvannas was bringing back night elves that would instantly follow her. As in, Sylvannas wasn't bringing back the entire soul of the night elves she killed. Instead, she was bringing back specific aspects of them, so specifically their hatred, their abandonment, their anger, all of those type of emotions that basically fit her purpose. And the best example of this would be Syrah Moonwarden and Delaran Summermoon. As in, Delaran seems to be the embodiment of sorrow at the moment, or at the very least, a very sad character, and Syrah, well, if you've read Shadows Rising, you kind of know precisely what's wrong with Syrah and how broken she is. Now, with these two concepts established, at the time, I basically assumed Sylvannas was a full resurrection, as in Arthas resurrected all of Sylvannas Windrunner when he killed her. I think I was wrong. I think Sylvannas Windrunner is a partial resurrection, and if she is a partial resurrection, as I said, everything about who she is, what she's been doing, and the entire arc of her character makes perfect sense. Why? Well, think about it like this. Arthas specifically brings back the sorrow of Sylvannas Windrunner when he reaches down for her soul. Why? As mentioned earlier, easier to control, but also he plans to turn her into a banshee, and as is literally described, I think it's in Warcraft 3, but as just like the general description of banshees in World of Warcraft, they're basically the aspect of sorrow from a soul made manifest, and over time they eventually come to hate all life in their sorrow, etc, etc. And so in the animatic where we see Sylvannas' soul being risen, that's what we initially see. But as the animatic goes, we obviously see Sylvannas' soul turn to complete rage after she sees the fallen child and mother. And the interesting thing is, the assumption was that was Arthas' doing, and in one aspect, that may have been the case. On the other hand, I think that was an unintended side effect of Sylvannas seeing that woman and child dead, as in her sorrow got mixed with incredible rage and anger and vengeance, basically. And so what you basically got is what I'm going to call the vengeance of Sylvannas Windrunner, the Banshee Queen as we currently know her, or at least that's what was brought back when Arthas raised quote-unquote Sylvannas. And seriously, from there, if you go on the assumption that Sylvannas Windrunner was a partial resurrection, or more precisely, the vengeance of Sylvannas Windrunner, or the vengeance and sorrow of Sylvannas Windrunner, was a partial resurrection, her entire character arc makes perfect sense. And from the minute this vengeance was created, to the minute Arthas died, or she realized Arthas was dead and she couldn't basically fulfill her purpose, makes perfect sense. As in, that was her main goal because that is what she was brought into the universe to do. And then she basically decided to die because she has no purpose anymore, no meaning in her life. What's rather interesting and a rather tragic thing about this though is we don't know how Sylvannas entered into the Maw. As in the End of Night story says she shattered her soul, and that may have been the case. But for some reason I think some of those pieces, or at least the piece that came back, may have actually went before the Arbiter. And the Arbiter, I almost guarantee you, would have sent that soul straight to the Maw. Why? It's because, as I mentioned before, the Arbiter seems to have a blind spot, as in, if your soul is related to Faith, you go to Bastion. If your soul is relentless when it comes before the Arbiter, you get sent to Maldraxxus, you know. This notion that the Arbiter only sees what is before her, regardless of how the soul got there, is a problem. Because just picture like what this vengeance of Sylvannas Windrunner would have been thinking in relation to its existence. As in, it can't comprehend hope, faith, any of the other general emotions. The only happiness and fulfillment it generally had was in hunting down and killing Arthas, and doing so in an incredibly ruthless manner. That's all it generally understood. And so that was how it gained happiness. But then it gets sent to the Maw, this horrible place, when it dies. But it literally cannot comprehend why it's been sent there. As in, it has the memories of its life prior to being undead. And let's be real here, if Sylvannas in life was going to end up anywhere, I would safely say she probably would have ended up in Reverendreth, not the Maw. But anyway, the spirit of vengeance ends up in the Maw, and in its own head it can't comprehend why. So what you basically have here is a spirit that was screwed over in life, that then gets screwed over in death because of how the Arbiter chooses where souls go. Which, honestly, is kind of sad, because I mean, if I was to put you in that same situation, where you only understood vengeance, didn't comprehend any other emotions, then when you die, you get sent to hell, and you can't comprehend why you've been sent to hell, you're not going to be happy. And honestly, if someone forcibly turns you into this type of creature, as in a creature of vengeance, and you still get sent to the Maw, I'm assuming you can imagine yourself being incredibly angry. I'm pretty sure that's how Sylvannas eventually ended up, or explains her later rage we've kind of seen. Can't like give a timeline. The vengeance of Sylvannas Windrunner is created. The vengeance of Sylvannas Windrunner decides to die. It ends up in the Maw. It cannot comprehend why it's in the Maw, and then is brought back. Now, this was possibly done by the jailer, but at the time, I'm willing to say Sylvannas was putting up a fair amount of resistance to whatever the jailer wanted it to do. As in, she may have had the magic lingering within her, as in the magic of the Maw, but it was not present at all. Reason why is because between Cataclysm, End of Wrath, and War Crimes, so End of Pandaria, Sylvannas was actually trying to change. As strange as it sounds, that spirit of vengeance was trying to find new meaning in life. It's why she was looking after the Forsaken. I mean, I think there's even a point in, I think it was either The Shattering or one of the books, where I think she tries making a rapport with Lorthamar, and Lorthamar literally just disregards her, which I can't exactly blame him for, considering she literally blackmailed the Blood Elves into fighting in Northrend. But once again, this creature of vengeance that really didn't get a choice in being the way it is, that's going to go to hell no matter the case, even though it really doesn't deserve it, is trying to learn. It's trying to change. And then, in War Crimes, that's when things start to go horribly wrong. Because I cannot stress enough how badly, and I mean badly, Varisa screwed over Sylvannas, or this vengeance of Sylvannas Windrunner. Because, I'll admit right now, what Sylvannas wanted to do with Varisa was twisted. Not gonna lie, was incredibly twisted. She wanted to turn her own sister into undead. But, and this is the thing, right? It was learning other emotions. Because I completely forgot this, but in the book, it explains that this spirit of vengeance has difficulty feeling other emotions because it literally hurts. Now, this could have been the jailer's influence, or just the fact that it's a spirit of vengeance and other emotions are kind of like other elements trying to interact with it, so it would just sting in general. But fundamentally, this spirit was trying to learn. It was genuinely trying to change. And then it gets betrayed in such a really bad manner. As in, it was basically as bad as someone using a text to break up with someone else. It was not pretty. And so Sylvannas goes on her rampage and basically rips apart, I think it's Tirisfal Glade, or just rips apart an entire forest, and basically resigns herself to being this cold figure. And at this point, I think this is where Sylvannas started either listening to the jailer, or at the very least started to investigate the jailer. Because post-War Crimes we enter WoD, and then we get Legion, and it's really interesting. Because during Legion, it seemed rather apparent that she's trying to get control of the Valkyr, and her excuse seems to be the same as it was in Cataclysm, as in she wants to basically create a future for the Forsaken. Now, again, royally screws that up, and Sylvannas gets royally pissed. As in that one part where she grips her bow, that was just a perfect epitome of how angry she was for someone who is rather cold and calculated. Around this time, or prior to this time, and as she was trying to basically secure the future of the Forsaken, Sylvannas started to investigate what was going on. Why did she end up in the Maw, etc., etc. Helya probably set her on the right course. The reason why I think Helya set her on the right course is because, well, Helya knows about the Shadowlands. She is the way she is because she knew about the Shadowlands. So she probably, once again, sent Sylvannas in the right direction. They had their interactions and whatnot. Now, it is seemingly confirmed in some broadcast texts that Helya wasn't working for the jailer at that point in time, as in Moisala brings Helya to the Maw after she dies. So this may have been Sylvannas' interaction with her, or Sylvannas may have just revealed her existence to the jailer, or Helya may have just been working with him the entire time. Hard to say. But for this theory, I'm going to say she wasn't connected. So once she wasn't connected to the jailer. So for Sylvannas, she was still trying to figure out what was going on, especially because at this point she's been made leader of the Horde by Aloa. And she knows Aloas are related to death, obviously, but once again, it's made clear in Before the Storm, she doesn't know why, as in what's going on. And this is where I think her touching Azerite becomes incredibly important. Because, well, basically, Azerite has a myriad of effects, like too many to count. It's basically a wonder metal that seems to be the origin of all types of metal on Azeroth. And one of the effects it seems to have is something very similar to Khajiit, as in the stuff that makes the goblins, well, basically have brains and be considerably smarter than they usually should be. As in the way Khajiit is kind of described, it's described as basically giving goblins ideas. And I think when Sylvannas touched the Azurite, it gave her an idea. As I think all of the knowledge she had from being an elf, from being undead, from her experiences with Hell, I think all of it finally started to align. As in when she says this changes everything, she's not referring to the Azurite. I think this is her aha moment. I think this is her, oh, I can actually do this given the right circumstances. I think at this point she started to gain a comprehension as to why she got sent to the Maw. And so basically from that point onward, the minute she touched the Azurite to, well, now, she's had a plan. And that plan, as it's basically described in Before the Storm, a goddess of creation and destruction. I think this spirit of vengeance, or Sylvannas' vengeance, is basically trying to destroy the Shadowlands, because I think it's rather obvious that she's going to take the Jailer's power, but the reason why she's going to take the Jailer's power is because she wants his power, and if I was to guess, she wants a loon's power, or at the very least, something akin to a loon. Why? So she can basically create her own afterlife, so she can basically create her own fate when she dies. Because, as I keep saying, but as I cannot stress enough, what technically happened to the spirit of Sylvannas Windrunner, or at least the vengeance of Sylvannas Windrunner, is not fair. It's like, it really isn't fair. I mean, I know life isn't fair, but if it's going to be this unfair, and Sylvannas is going to spend an eternal torment in the Maw if she doesn't do anything, kind of makes sense why she's doing what she's doing. But anyway, that entire long, convoluted theory basically comes from the idea that if Sylvannas Windrunner, or more precisely the vengeance of Sylvannas Windrunner, is a partial resurrection instead of a full resurrection, as an Arthas only brought back part of that soul, the whole soul, then, as I said, everything in relation to her character, from the genocide she's been willing to commit to the inadvertent outbursts of rage, all makes sense. Because seriously, the universe screwed that spirit over to the nth degree, and it may actually give extra context as to why she is forsaken. Also add here, I am actually very curious as to what may have happened to the other half of Sylvannas' soul if her soul was split when Arthas resurrected her, because it would be rather interesting to see where that soul would have ended up. Because if it did end up in the Maw anyway, okay, cool, makes sense, Sylvannas is just pure evil from day one. But if it didn't, it would be very interesting to see where it did end up and what Sylvannas' fate probably would have been. Alright, so coming back to the start, I basically mentioned that this whole animatic and like the story at the forefront of this animatic basically gives a very good indication as to where things are going in relation to Bastion, possibly Oribos, and overall the Shadowlands. And the reason I mention that is because all of this seems to be boiling down to a concept or theme in relation to justice and vengeance. Now, what do I mean by that? To get started, I'll start with the Covenant that seems to have gotten the worst rap out of all of them, and that is Bastion and the Kyrian. You don't have to look far to see how negatively everyone sees Bastion, especially in relation to what they do to the Ascended and what the Ascended have to go through in relation to purging their memories, etc, etc. And in one aspect, I completely get it. I 100% get it, especially considering the Kyrian process seems to be forced upon souls and it's not really an optional choice. But at the same time, what Uther's whole story, at least for me, proved is that what the Kyrian go through, as in the idea of purging their memories, the idea of them becoming incredibly impartial in regards to their job, makes perfect sense. As in, why they do it is because if they didn't do it, there'd be so many cases of what Uther did, it'd be near impossible to justify the existence of the Kyrian to begin with. The Kyrian need to be impartial. And when you consider the tenets of the Kyrian, as in purity, humility, wisdom, courage, and loyalty, all of them except for loyalty would be incredibly idealistic for impartial guides of souls. The question, and this seems to be the literal crux of Bastion's story and what's seemingly going to be the crux of all the Shadowlands, is loyalty. Or more precisely, what in the world is the purpose? What does the purpose state? What is the whole idea behind the purpose? Because as I mentioned, if you remove loyalty from the Kyrian's tenets, it's pretty damn idealistic, especially when you compare them to the Holy Light, which is literally retribution, justice, compassion, holiness, protection. I mean, I think it was Arthas who came out with the Lights of Vaunted Justice. He has a point. In comparison to the Kyrian, the Light is incredibly biased in the way it thinks about punishment and justice. Quackery, in relation to what they do, quite impartial. But once again, it comes down to loyalty and the purpose. And what I think Uther's role is going to be, and what I think his whole story is going to be, is how Kyrian Bastion and possibly the whole Shadowlands as a whole drop quote-unquote loyalty, as in basically drop the purpose, and instead go for what I would assume is either justice, so genuine justice, or compassion. And when I say genuine justice, what I mean by that is impartial as possible sentencing for all souls, as in the Kyrian remain impartial caretakers of souls, as in they guide them to the Arbiter. And the Arbiter, well, instead of being loyal to the purpose, may change and instead become, well, related to justice, or at the very least start to take into consideration the context of a soul's life, instead of just paying attention to what a soul happens to relate to, as in faith, vengeance, etc., when it arrives. I'll also mention this now. The reason why I don't think the Kyrian are actually that bad is because, well, purity, humility, wisdom, and courage, at least for me, and feel free to correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, they remind me of aspects of Buddhism, and what the ascension process the Kyrian go through overall, once again, reminds me of aspects of Buddhism, as in specifically aspects of where you basically cleanse yourself of like mortal desires, mortal tethers, and ascend to a higher state of being. That literally seems to be the whole purpose of the Kyrian. The only issue with the Kyrian, and I'm going to be saying this a lot, is the loyalty aspect, as in, what is the purpose? Like, what is the mandate by which all the Shadowlands kind of works? Because until we kind of get an indication as to what that is, everything in relation to what's going on in the Shadowlands is rather iffy and up in the air, as in there are significantly large amount of question marks about what's going on. I also say compassion, and that is the other possibility. Instead of justice, it's compassion. And the reason why it would be compassion instead of loyalty is because, well, compassion's kind of needed in relation to, well, certain cases, as in, well, once again, consider Sylvannas' case, where her soul was forcibly split, and you have one aspect that's pure vengeance and just exists as vengeance, and so when it dies will just go to the maw, which is pretty damn unreasonable. And on the other hand, you got other souls like Uther that got split into faith and his more human aspects. Because for some reason, I think that more human aspect probably would have ended up in Revendreth or another part of the Shadowlands if the soul was whole. And so compassion fits into all this by basically forcing the Kyrian and the Arbiter and the Shadowlands as a whole to just consider what has happened to these souls, to consider the context before passing judgment. I mean, even that Necromancer in BFA, like that one Necromancer side quest, where you find out about this son of these two priests of Bwonsamdi, and the son really doesn't want to go with Bwonsamdi, and ends up doing some incredibly heinous things to avoid going with Bwonsamdi. And I'll admit now, after everything that son did, he deserves to go to Bwonsamdi. No questions asked. But the question is, would he have been given a choice considering what his parents had kind of aligned themselves with, and considering they were a priest of Bwonsamdi? Like, would that soul have actually gotten a choice to go anywhere else but the other side? And so yeah, I guess what Afterlives Bastion does really well is that it sets up the whole premise and theme of Shadowlands incredibly well. And considering it is the first animatic shown, it kind of makes sense of why that is the case. Okay, so that was the first ramblings of a Mad Duck. I apologize for how rambly that was, and hopefully over time I will get better at overall just talking in general. So until next time, thank you for listening.